In the quiet countryside of 1851 Virginia, nestled among tobacco farms and dense woodlands, lived the Henderson twins Isadora and Imogen. From the moment of their birth, the two girls were unlike any other children the town of Oak Hollow had seen. Born to Lydia and Edward Henderson, a schoolteacher and a tailor, respectively, the girls exhibited a kind of connection that the locals could not explain. At first, it was passed off as the natural closeness of twins. They cried in unison, laughed in harmony, and even reached for the same toys at the exact moment without looking at each other. But as they grew older, this bond evolved into something unsettling to those around them. It wasn't long before people began whispering about the strange synchronicity that surrounded the Henderson household. By the age of 4, Isadora would often stop playing and clutch her knee. Moments before Imogen would fall and injure hers. Their mother recounted one afternoon when Isadora screamed and fainted in the parlor, just as Imogen, who had been across town with her father, was bitten by a rabid dog. Doctors attempted to find plausible explanations, suggesting heightened empathy or mere coincidence, but their theories fell apart when the events became increasingly specific and impossible to ignore. In one chilling instance, Reverend Alden was giving a sermon in the chapel when both girls, seated quietly in the front pew, suddenly stood up, turned toward the back doors, and screamed at the top of their lungs. Moments later, a man burst into the church in panic. Announcing that the stable behind the chapel was ablaze, neighbors began to report that the girls would often speak to one another without moving their lips, exchanging glances that seemed to carry full sentences. A former governess who had briefly worked in the Henderson home claimed the girls once answered her question in perfect unison, using the same tone and inflection, though only one of them had been looking at her. More than once, townsfolk observed them finishing each other's sentences, not in the playful way many siblings do, but in seamless, unnatural continuity. The atmosphere around them was often described as charged, as if the air itself felt heavy with something unnamed. Animals, particularly dogs, would grow agitated in their presence, and more than one pet had to be restrained or removed from the house. What puzzled observers most was the pattern of shared injury. If one twin was hurt, the other exhibited symptoms. Within minutes even, when they were far apart. Once, while climbing a tree, Imogen fractured her collarbone. Isadora, at that moment, was playing with a doll in the attic and collapsed, screaming in pain. Her collarbone showed redness and swelling, though no visible trauma had occurred. Physicians examined the case, and though Isadora's X-rays later showed no break, she carried a bruise identical in shape and location to her sister's. Dr. E. Harold Trenton, one of the few medical professionals who studied the girls at the time, documented more than a dozen such cases and submitted his findings to the Richmond Medical College. His papers were never published. Rumors later surfaced that Dr. Trenton had been warned by church officials and pressured by political figures to withdraw his claims to prevent mass hysteria. Teachers at the local school described the girls as academically gifted but socially withdrawn. They would often appear disoriented, unable to focus if separated from one another for too long. During a brief experiment, the headmistress arranged for them to be placed in different classrooms for 1 week. By the second day, both girls began exhibiting signs of intense anxieties, wetting, shaking, and in one case, fainting mid-lesson. By the fourth day, they were found huddled together outside the headmistress's office, having left their respective classes without permission. When asked how they had known where to find each other, neither could provide an answer. They simply said, "We heard each other calling." The notion of telepathy was not widely accepted in scientific circles during the mid-19th century, and especially not in a place like Oak Hollow, where traditional values and religious beliefs dominated daily life. The local clergy were particularly disturbed by what they referred to as unnatural influence. Reverend Alden began to preach against the twins' abilities, suggesting their bond might be the result of something darker, something demonic. He warned parents to keep their children at a distance and implored the Hendersons to allow a cleansing ritual to be performed. The family, though devout Christians, refused. They believed their daughter's bond was a divine gift, not a curse. The backlash was swift. The Henderson family faced growing isolation. Other children stopped playing with the girls. Adults crossed the street to avoid them. Anonymous notes with Bible verses about witchcraft and sin appeared on the Henderson doorstep. Despite this, the girls remained remarkably composed, leaning into each other with a resilience few understood. Their bond, if anything, only grew stronger under pressure. They began to exhibit additional phenomena that deepened the mystery. Isadora once described a dream she had of drowning in a river, only for Imogen to awaken that same night coughing up water with no logical explanation. The next day they both drew identical pictures of a bridge they had never visited, with a girl falling into the water. Their mother kept these drawings and showed them to the town historian, who confirmed that the bridge bore a striking resemblance to one that had collapsed 30 years prior. During a flood that killed a young girl their exact age, science at the time lacked the language or tools to process what was unfolding. No tests, no logical framework could make sense of the events. Physicians and scholars who came to observe the girls often left confused or dismissive. A professor from Philadelphia, Dr. Marcus Lyell, traveled to Oak Hollow after reading second-hand accounts in a fringe medical journal. He spent 5 days observing the twins, conducting various tests and interviews. On the 6th day, he packed up his notes and departed without explanation. Years later, a student of Dr. Lyell's claimed to have seen his unpublished manuscript titled The Henderson Anomaly, filled with speculations about extrasensory perception, mirrored neurology, and the possibility of shared consciousness, a concept far ahead of its time. As the girls approached adolescence, their abilities became more difficult to ignore, and their presence more unsettling to those around them. The town, already steeped in superstition and wary of anything outside the norm, grew increasingly hostile. Accusations began to flee claims of devil worship, curses, and unnatural forces. People spoke of bad crops and dying livestock as signs that the twins were bringing misfortune to Oak Hollow. Under pressure and fearing for their safety, the Henderson family withdrew almost entirely from public life, eventually leaving town under the cover of darkness, their destination unknown. The house they left behind stood empty for years before it mysteriously burned down. No one claimed responsibility. The official report listed the cause as undetermined, but many whispered that it was the town's way of erasing what it could not explain. To this day, the story of the Henderson twins lingers as a local legend, dismissed by science but etched into the uneasy memory of those who lived through their time in Virginia. The Henderson twins, Isadora and Imogen, exhibited behaviors that left even the most seasoned medical professionals of 1851 Virginia baffled. While their synchronized emotional responses and telepathic tendencies drew whispers, it was the strange occurrence of shared injuries that truly crossed the line between coincidence and the unexplainable. These physical manifestations defied every known law of medicine. The twins' shared pain was not symbolic, it was visible, measurable, and in some cases severe. When one suffered trauma, the other would react with the same symptoms, despite no physical cause. These occurrences were witnessed not just by family members, but by doctors, townsfolk, teachers, and clergy alike. The phenomenon began with small, seemingly dismissible incidents, but quickly evolved into deeply disturbing episodes that blurred the line between the scientific and the supernatural. The earliest documented incident occurred when Imogen fell while playing on a wooden swing and fractured her left wrist. Isadora, who had been indoors arranging pine cones in the fireplace, screamed at the exact moment of the fall and was later found clutching her left arm, white-faced and sweating. Her wrist bore no fracture, but the swelling and bruising mirrored Imogen's perfectly. Dr. Gerald White, a respected physician in Oak Hollow, examined both girls and noted that while only one wrist was broken, both had identical external symptoms. He wrote in his journal that it was as though pain had been divided, but expressed fully in both bodies. At the time, such an idea was considered absurd and filed away as anecdotal. More alarming was the event in late spring, when the girls were separated during a visit to Richmond. Isadora stayed at home due to illness, while Imogen accompanied their father. During the trip, Imogen was nearly trampled by a startled horse, though she was only bruised. At the exact hour and minute, Isadora began screaming in bed, unable to breathe. Witnesses noted her chest bore scrape marks similar to those caused by the horse's harness, even though she had not left her room in days. Their mother was so shaken that she demanded a priest be consulted, though the local church advised prayer over panic. Still, the evidence was mounting. Something was occurring that no one could explain, something that traditional science refused to touch. The case grew even stranger as the girls aged. During a rare bout of illness, Imogen developed a fever that caused convulsions. Though Isadora appeared outwardly healthy, she exhibited identical tremors at the same time. When the family physician attempted to draw blood from Imogen, Isadora fainted in the next room. Over time, their physical responses began to mimic each other, so closely that keeping them apart became emotionally and medically dangerous. The parents took detailed notes and began documenting the time, symptoms, and effects with obsessive precision. These records, stored in a small wooden chest, were later found and partially preserved by a historian decades later, providing chilling insight into a situation that had spiraled beyond the reach of human understanding. One particularly bizarre incident occurred when the girls were playing with a group of children by a stream. Imogen slipped and struck her head on a submerged rock, rendering her unconscious for nearly a minute. Simultaneously, Isadora, standing on the opposite bank, collapsed to the ground and began seizing. Though she had not touched the water nor suffered any physical impact, she was found with a gash on her scalp that mimicked the one later discovered on Imogen. Both were rushed home, bleeding and dazed, their parents once again forced to confront the terrifying reality that their daughters shared something far deeper than blood or affection. It wasn't long before word spread beyond Oak Hollow. A traveling physician from New York, Dr. Luther Varnum, caught wind of the case through correspondence with a local apothecary. He visited the Henderson home in the fall of 1851, requesting permission to observe the girls over the course of 2 weeks. Varnum was skeptical, determined to find signs of fabrication or hysteria. He administered basic physical tests and introduced mild stressors to each twin, separately cold compresses, pinpricks, and exposure to unpleasant scents. The reactions were consistent. If one twin was exposed, the other reacted simultaneously, even in separate rooms. Varnum kept meticulous notes and eventually conceded that there were elements he could not explain, though he hesitated to use the word telepathic. He did refer to their connection as biological entanglement, a phrase well ahead of its time. Perhaps the most disturbing event came near the end of that year, when Isadora suffered a deep cut on her hand while sewing. Blood stained her apron, and the family rushed to tend to her wound. In the chaos, no one noticed Imogen, who had been in the garden alone until she returned with a matching injury on the same hand, bleeding in precisely the same pattern. The scissors were still in the house. She had no sharp objects with her, no injuries from brambles or tools. Yet the wound matched not just in location, but in shape, size, and depth. Dr. White returned to examine both girls and wrote simply, 2 wounds, 1 source. I have no further comment. The entry marked the last he ever made on the Henderson twins. These events did not go unnoticed by the religious and superstitious members of the community. Rumors of witchcraft, dark arts, or possession began to swirl. Though the twins were quiet, polite, and seemingly harmless, their strangeness was enough to ignite fear. The shared injuries were viewed not as scientific anomalies, but as divine warnings or unholy signs. Even those who had once defended the Henderson family began to withdraw. When livestock on a nearby farm died suddenly, people whispered that the twins had passed by just days earlier. The town's fear turned to avoidance, then to hostility. Medical science, unprepared to investigate the unexplained without ridicule, turned its back. Physicians refused to return calls. Clergy distanced themselves from the case. The family was alone. As the twins approached their teenage years, the shared injuries became more sporadic but more intense. One winter evening, a candle tipped over and burned Isadora's leg. Imogen, who was upstairs at the time, screamed in agony before the flame even touched her sister's skin. Her leg bore a red welt, identical in size and pattern to the eventual burn, Both were left with the same scar. The trauma of this event led their parents to remove all open flames from the house and limit the girls' interaction with the outside world. Their home became a kind of sanctum, sealed from the world and full of whispered worries and unanswered questions. Attempts to draw attention from larger medical institutions failed. Letters were ignored, records lost or misplaced. The few professionals who did witness the events often withdrew their involvement or refused to speak publicly. Even those inclined toward curiosity feared ridicule or professional ruin. Thus, the shared injuries of the Henderson twins became an open secret documented by private journals, etched into the memories of locals but never studied formally. Science, with its need for reproducibility and rational explanation, had no place for the uncanny truth playing out in the hills of Virginia. The medical world looked away, unwilling to confront the case that could not be measured, controlled, or explained by the tools it held dear. The Henderson twins remained both mystery and myth, caught in the void between observation and belief, between medicine and miracle. In the years following the initial fascination and fear surrounding the Henderson twins, a quieter yet more insidious aspect of their story began to emerge, one that unfolded not in front of townsfolk or curious doctors, but in the pages of vanished journals, the hushed confessions of dismissed clergy, and sealed letters sent to scientific societies that never replied. It was the part of their case that suggested forces at play beyond twin synchronicity or medical anomaly, hinting, instead, at something the age was neither willing nor able to face. The girls' connection went beyond shared pain and emotion. It reached into realms that suggested a single consciousness split between two forms, a phenomenon science would not study and the church dared not name. At the heart of this mystery were the private writings of those closest to the family governesses, physicians, and, most notably, Lydia Henderson herself. A journal recovered nearly 40 years after the family disappeared revealed entries that chronicled experiences far stranger than those known to the general public. Lydia described moments when the girls would sit in silence for hours, staring at one another, occasionally blinking in perfect sync, lips twitching as if forming words without sound. One entry told of a night when she entered their room and found them standing beside each other, eyes closed, hands hovering inches apart, speaking in what she described as an identical whisper. The language they used wasn't English. Lydia believed it was some kind of code, but one that neither of the girls ever wrote down or taught to anyone. She noted that they never recalled these nighttime events the next morning, or claimed not to understand what she meant when questioned. Even more unsettling were the dreams the girls reportedly shared. On multiple occasions, they would wake screaming at precisely the same moment, sometimes from different rooms in the house. When asked what they had seen, their descriptions matched down to the last detail: a burning house, a faceless man standing by a tree, a baby crying beneath floorboards. Lydia began to suspect that they were not simply having similar dreams, but were somehow participating in the same dream, navigating the same landscape together. When a psychiatrist from Baltimore, Dr. Henry Galloway, briefly corresponded with the family after receiving an anonymous letter, he offered a theory that the girls might be engaging in co-conscious episodes, a concept even he admitted had no place in formal psychiatric practice. Dr. Galloway never visited in person, stopped writing after the third letter, and never responded to follow-up inquiries. There were stories that clergy knew more than they publicly admitted, Reverend Alden, who had once tried to organize a ritual cleansing, kept a separate journal now archived at a private seminary library in Richmond. In its pages were entries that expressed both dread and theological confusion. He once described witnessing the girls as they stood in the chapel alone, after hours, singing a hymn in reverse. He believed it was a form of mimicry, but the harmony, the timing, the sheer unnatural perfection of it left him shaken. He asked if they had practiced such a thing, but both girls looked at him in silence, seemingly unaware of what he was referring to. He later noted that their presence made him feel watched from behind his own eyes, a phrase repeated 3 times in different entries. When the bishop was informed, he told Alden to stop pursuing the matter, stating that some truths were better left to God. The journal of Dr. Harold Trenton, preserved in fragments by his niece, contains even more speculative commentary. After observing the twins on and off for 6 months, he began to question whether their behavior could be linked to any known pathology. He ruled out shared trauma, imitation, and delusion. What he could not rule out was something he called mirrored essence, a term he borrowed from folklore. He referred to European tales of doppelgangers, Slavic myths of soul bonds, and an obscure 14th century German medical text that described twin-borns whose spirits danced between bodies as if inhabiting both. Dr. Trenton's last entry about the Henderson twins was dated December 1851. He described an encounter where he attempted to interview Isadora while Imogen sat in a separate room. He asked simple questions: favorite colors, foods, stories. But Isadora gave answers that contradicted what she had said earlier that week. When he rejoined Imogen and repeated the same questions, her answers matched those Isadora had just given word for word. Trenton began to suspect that they were no longer operating as two individuals, but rather a single mind navigating to physical forms. He never submitted his findings. Shortly after, he resigned from his post and moved to Massachusetts, where he refused to speak of the case again. Several townspeople believed that strange occurrences increased when the twins were in distress. One neighbor told of clocks stopping when the girls passed by, of mirrors cracking in empty rooms, of candle flames flickering sideways despite the absence of wind. These accounts, recorded in private letters and old diaries, were never reported officially, but became part of the oral history of Oak Hollow. A carpenter who worked on the Hendersons' attic claimed he heard voices whispering behind the walls. Though no one else was present, a seamstress swore that during a fitting, the girls blinked simultaneously in a rhythmic pattern. She fainted after becoming overwhelmed by the sensation that her own heartbeat had changed to match theirs, what science refused to explore. Folklore absorbed. The twins became figures of myth even before they vanished. Tales of the shared soul sisters spread through nearby towns. Children played games invoking their names, while adults crossed themselves if their path brought them too close to the Henderson house. The family, increasingly isolated, withdrew from society altogether. Lydia ceased her correspondence. Edward stopped working altogether, rumored to be obsessed with deciphering the girls' drawing sketches filled with strange symbols, identical scenes of houses the family had never visited, and intricate patterns resembling mandalas split evenly between 2 pages, each drawn by a different twin. Eventually, letters sent to scientific journals went unanswered. Requests for study, support, or even spiritual aid were dismissed, misplaced, or outright ignored. No academic wanted to be associated with something so fraught with superstition and ambiguity. Church authorities warned that further pursuit could lead to accusations of heresy or possession. The Henderson twins' case became taboo. The silence surrounding them grew thicker than the mystery itself. In time, they disappeared from official records, their existence relegated to footnotes and local lore. What remains of their story exists only in fragment-scorched pages, incomplete journals, whispered recollections, and half-forgotten fears. The very institutions meant to investigate such mysteries turned away, unwilling to risk their credibility on what could not be named, categorized, or controlled. Science refuses to study the Henderson twins, not because the evidence was lacking, but because it threatened the boundaries of what science believed it could safely understand. The twins' case remains an unresolved wound in the fabric of history, where logic collapsed and something deeper, darker, and perhaps older waited silently in its place.